15, we talk about the Commerce Clause and the regulatory process here in the United States, which I find, especially the regulatory process, especially meaningful now because of some of the stuff that is going on. So let's take a look at that. And of course, I always have not always, but oftentimes have a little humor. This fits my spring class. I think that's why I put it in there, because generally I'd be talking about this when the Masters was going on. So yeah. I guess I should go back and put that one with our study of the Constitution. Was that chapter 6 perhaps? So things that we want to do, right? We want to talk about the power of the government to regulate businesses. Talk a little bit about state and local government, regulatory power and what they can and maybe can't do. Okay. Apply essential reasons for administrative agencies, role of courts, which is limited, but we'll talk about that. And allow you to create your own judgment. Yeah. U.S. Constitution does provide a framework for the federal government and its authority to regulate business activities, and that comes in the Commerce Clause, right? Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. I will tell you that this is, and we'll talk about an example a little bit later, but this is interpreted very, very, very broadly. And to know this actual words, because I could put in there, leave one of these out, the foreign nations or the several states, and make you fill in the blank on a test. I would do that. So key areas, right? Regulation, right? And regulation of foreign commerce is something, of course, that happens, and also interstate commerce, probably a far bigger part of this. But there's limitations then too on the federal government's ability to regulate some things, and that's where state police power comes in and state taxation. And we'll talk about that, right? So in terms of foreign commerce, the federal government has the exclusive right to regulate foreign commerce. So states can't enter into let's put it this way: states can't enter into separate deals that are not consistent with federal law. States can sure, because you'll hear about it, them going on a trip over and trying to negotiate the sale of, some wheat or those types of things, and they can sure do those things as long as they're within the confines of the federal regulatory framework. They can do that without any problems. But it's the federal government's going to set treaties. It's the federal government that had until recently banned the import of items from Cuba and banned travel to Cuba and banned the export of items to Cuba. And they do that periodically with other nations too that we may be having disputes with, right? But states can't do that. A state can regulate commerce if it occurs entirely within the state boundaries. That's the part. It's hard to come up with examples of things that aren't, and again, I'll explain that a little bit later, but it's hard to come up with examples of things that are considered entirely within the state boundaries that do not affect interstate commerce. So interstate commerce is commerce among the several states, and that doesn't mean the state governments, right? That means people or entities within the states, persons engaged in activities, right, that affect. Okay, and here's the example of the power. Is very, very broad. Wickard versus Filburn, and Filburn was a wheat farmer in Ohio, and he grew a little bit of wheat. And this goes way back to, I think it was Depression era even, and he grew a little bit of wheat, but the wheat that he grew was totally for his own family's use and use as feed on his farm, fed it to pigs or whatever. Okay, and the government came in, and I think this was Depression era, and they were putting just restrictions on acres and what you could grow and couldn't grow, etc. And And he fought it. He said, well, wait a minute. He says, I'm not participating in any of the government programs or anything, and I'm not even selling my wheat. It's for use strictly on the farm. And that case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled against him and said, sorry, but because wheat is a commodity and its prices are vary based on the amount produced and on and on and on, no matter how small, and the reason that we can't make an exception for small, because if we did, then it may happen with bigger farmers as well, but no matter how small the impact, there could be an impact on the pricing and whatnot based on the fact that you have some acres planted to wheat, and so therefore we do have regulatory authority over your farm. So interesting decision, again, a long time ago, but it certainly demonstrates that the Commerce Clause is very broadly interpreted. Who's the ultimate interpreter of the Constitution? Let's go with C, right? The Supreme Court. Police powers, right? State legislation and regulation to protect the public's health, safety, morals, and general welfare. Morals, ooh, that one seems to have gone missing. Yeah, well. What this often means, I guess I should mention a little bit, but what this often means is that states can go above and beyond, right? So they can create other laws. There's not necessarily a restriction. We're gonna talk about the Commerce Clause and the fact that it has little restrictions, but for states they're not necessarily restricted. We often refer to California. California has laws, typically like environmental laws and whatnot, that go well beyond what the federal government has done. And there's nothing to block that, right? They can certainly do that. The government doesn't put limitations necessarily on the state's government ability to do that. There are some limitations, of course, constitutional, but we'll talk about some of those maybe as well. Okay. But generally speaking, states can pass laws that are more restrictive than what the Commerce Clause has or the federal government has. Dormant Commerce Clause that limits state police powers, and so generally speaking, and this is the case, generally speaking, our Constitution was a restrictive document. It said that the government shall make no laws infringing upon a person's right to speech, say, or we have the right to bear arms and some things like that. So it restricted the federal government, and this kind of said, when it gets to the Commerce Clause, that the federal government's going to have the ability to maybe do some restrictions of state types of laws, right? If they're arbitrary, if they're capricious, if they're unreasonable, things like that, the Commerce Clause would kick in and the federal government could regulate those things. So, areas of regulation. There are some that are exclusively federal, some that are exclusively state, okay? And then dual regulation is probably the most common, right? In dual regulation, again, there's federal preemption, but again, there's nothing, for the most part, nothing that stops a state from additional regulations, using my California as an example. Regulation, but no preemption. Irreconcilable conflicts, if there's an undue burden, those are going to be court cases that are going to have to decide that. Okay, and then there can be, in cases where there is no federal regulation and the states step in to do that. In Montana, we've got lots of regulations on the hunting and fishing. Okay, now there's federal regulations that have to do with endangered species and whatnot, right? But in terms of the hunting and fishing and whatnot, there isn't any real federal regulations on those or outside of those animals that are on the endangered list and whatnot. And so our state is pretty well free to do that, right? Cannot have discrimination, of course. State taxation can be a form of regulation. Taxes on booze and cigarettes. Okay, where it's not just trying to raise money, but also trying to limit those activities a bit. But it's limited by the Commerce Clause, and taxes can be apportioned, meaning that the Commerce Clause is set up that for some companies, to try to ferret out exactly what Walmart sells in Montana, might be really difficult, okay, and what kind of profit they might make in the state of Montana. And so they allow a system of apportionment where they can apportion a certain amount of their costs, to the state of Montana, and they can do those types of things and let them do the math, based on, perhaps just all based on, say, the amount of sales compared to their total national sales. They can do an apportionment and make the calculation a little bit easier. There has to be a sufficient tie, or a nexus, or a taxable situs. Again, these deal, I think, with business taxes mostly, saying that we can't just tax somebody's or tax a company unless they actually do business, right? We can't put a tax on. I'm trying to think of a company that would in no way do business, in the state of Montana, just because maybe their plane flew overhead. That would not be a sufficient tie or a nexus, right? Think of an airline company that flies over the top of Montana all the time but doesn't have a presence here. Okay, but if they do business here, if they own real estate here, if they have personal property here, those types of things, it does create a tie or a nexus that allows us then to perhaps have some taxation. Flopping from the Commerce Clause, or it's not flopping from it, I should say, but the Commerce Clause then really has put us in a place where we have regulatory agencies that handle a lot of this stuff. And again, I think that this is especially pertinent now, and we've had discussions about some of the regulations that have put in place, and that judges have struck down in some cases. Judges have put injunctions in place because it's we've had an interesting period really for the last decade or two in terms of the amount of regulations that have come forward. So but the regulatory process is the authority of government right to regulate professional and personal lives. Said it is founded in constitutional principles, again from the Commerce Clause, right, and the police powers that we have for state and local. I put this on here because the Weather Service is actually one of those federal agencies. So we've seen, an increase in the government's influence, and part of that's out of necessity. I mean, who would have thought 100 years ago that we'd have the internet and that we'd have cars that can go down the highway at 150 miles an hour, or that we're going to have cars that are self-driving. Who envisioned this stuff when they certainly didn't when they set up the Constitution? And so the government's involvement in those things has had to grow as well, right? So the regulatory process is use of administrative agencies at federal, state, and local levels. Implement laws and policies, rules, often as well, we would call those, rules that have the same effect as law. Okay, so what are they? All boards, bureaus, commissions, organizations that make up the governmental bureaucracy. So we deal with them daily. Okay, whether we think we do or not, we deal with them daily. What do? They can provide some specificity about things that are going on, about what's required and what's not, maybe. They provide expertise, and certainly, again, I'll harken back to the Weather Service and say there's an example. We'd all be probably a little we wouldn't enjoy our days maybe as much if we didn't have a Weather Service that would kind of let us know what's going on, right? Private companies might fill that void, might not. Provide protection. So some of the agencies are those agencies that provide protection for us. Secret Service agency, they protect the president and whatnot. They also deal with counterfeiting and those types of things, right? And there's other agencies. OSHA provides protection for workplace accidents and those types of things, right? Provide regulation. That one's obvious. And they provide services, and the services and the expertise, not necessarily dissimilar, but we get services from others as well. Farm Service Agency, although farmers sometimes agree or disagree upon the services that they might provide. But certainly they provide, again, the Weather Service. I keep getting back to that, and I know the National Highway Transportation, that's expertise and services. They're figuring out what's happening, and so hopefully it'll minimize wrecks or casualties and whatnot from wrecks. And the FAA and the FTC and even the folks that check us when we get on the airplane, to make sure that the people riding with us aren't carrying bombs or something, right? And so those types of things are important. Okay, they do create and enforce the majority of the business laws that happen. Some examples. And you can read through those. At last count, I thought there were 76 federal, and that was several years ago, so I wouldn't doubt that we're up over 80 now. Isn't that a misnomer? Internal Revenue Service. I don't know what service they provide, but in any event, yeah. So what do agencies do? They can make rules. This is probably a part that's been under some scrutiny here recently. They adjudicate, so they have their own laws, really, and they have their own judicial departments kind of within those agencies. That seems kind of weird, doesn't it? They advise, okay, and they investigate. And the advising, again, might get back to safety standards and those types of things. Rulemaking is a quasi-legislative function, right? It can be industry-specific or generally cover all. I wonder if that's supposed to be cover all. Oh, I might have to fix that. What a lousy typo. Guidelines may be published to supplement rules. So oftentimes rules happen, and they have meetings and whatnot. I remember we had lots of meetings around here when the Upper Missouri National Monument was being proposed and whatnot, and you could go to hearings and you'd have the right to be heard. You could stand up and express your opinion and do all those things, and they supposedly took those opinions into consideration when they finally drafted the rules about how the Upper Missouri River National Wildlife or National Monument was going to be, managed. And that's just one example. Okay, and there are other examples of rules that take place. A lot of them are probably not as obvious. Okay, but trust me, if you're in certain industries, you're checking the Federal Register. You probably have lawyers or people on your staff, but you're checking that Federal Register every day to see if there might be new rules that would be coming down the line that you could certainly object to. The farm and ranch, when we had the water, and now we've got states that are suing, right, to try to overturn the new regulations on waterways. People were paying attention, right? And I don't know, I mean, that one was fairly well publicized. I don't think they were trying to slide that in the back door or anything, but you had people on staffs of those farm and ranch organizations that knew they were paying attention. They brought it to the attention of the states who filed suit, et cetera, right? So there is a due process, right? There has to be that public notice, and a lot of the rules might be really small, and you and I, the agency suggests that it seems obvious and it happens. Okay, some of them, like the waterway one, are a little bit bigger, and so they notice, they publicly show what the proposed rule is. That's in a place called the Federal Register. You and I can go look at the Federal Register any day and see what our new proposals and whatnot. They'll often have public hearings. Again, I think in some of the small cases it may not be required. So what happens then if you don't like it? Certainly you can contact the agency itself and those that are in charge and talk about it, or if you do like it. Okay, but also, and probably this gets more attention than anything, is contacting your member of Congress. Okay, if you don't like what's going to happen, you contact your member of Congress and you yell and scream a little bit and tell them, of course, you won't vote for them next time if they allow that piece of crap, or whatever to pass. And so that's a fairly common method of dealing with those things. So
times like this.
Since guidelines, right? So the published guidelines, right? They're not rules of laws or regulations. They don't carry similar force. So isn't that interesting? And of course, this probably has to do with the IRS as much as anything. Even if you call the IRS and get advice from them about filling out your tax return and it's wrong, um, you're still wrong, and you can't go back against the IRS for giving you bad advice, which I find kind of interesting. It seems to fly in the face of our right of redress that we have in the Constitution, but oh well. And so this would be similar for businesses as well. Just because you're following the guidelines that went along with a rule, they're saying it doesn't mean that it's a defense. Oh, I did get that updated. Of course, it should be she sees you when you're sleeping, she knows when you're awake. And Loretta Lynch, of course, is now and she's been in the news quite a bit here lately, but now the head of the Department of Justice, our Attorney General, okay, is what her title is, but that means she's the head of the Department of Justice and has definitely been in the news quite a bit here lately. So adjudicating, yeah, it's a quasi-judicial function. So they have their own court systems, basically. There are over 1,000, okay, and I think the book will give you a number, 1,150 or 1,050 or 1,100, something like that, administrative law judges in the United States, and those judges adjudicate the laws that pertain to that particular agency. Okay, and so their jobs are a lot more specific, and as such, of course, they obviously have really excellent experience, okay, in those particular areas. They've got a certain amount of expertise in those areas that's better, more important than, a general law judge might have, right? Okay. And so there can be fact-finding, and they do apply laws to situations. So there is a due process that goes along with agencies too. It may not be exactly the same as what we have in legal, in a otherwise legal sense, but there is due process, certainly. Those judges can issue cease and desist orders, and also consent orders can get approved by a judge. So what's a consent decree? And again, some of these are minor. We had several of these at the bank where the examiners might come in and find you were deficient in some small areas, and not unlike we might have when we go through accreditation here. And although accreditation isn't done by an agency necessarily, but we'd have something similar, and they'd write you up, and you'd talk about it, and you'd give them ideas for fixing the problem. And so you'd write all that up, and both sides would agree, and you'd sign it, and the judge would stamp it sometimes if the judge needed to, depending on how maybe complex it was, or how important it was, or how big the issues were. And then away you went, and that was a consent decree. And so very, very common. These just aren't, they're not a huge deal. They happen all the time, don't get me wrong, and it can be a huge deal. If you did something that was terribly inappropriate, okay, it can be a huge deal. A cease and desist is a little bit, is maybe a little harsher. And sometimes this can happen if maybe you're having a disagreement about about a rule and how it should be applied, and so it can go to that administrative law judge, and the law judge might issue a cease and desist, which would say that you have to stop those activities. Okay, you have to stop those activities until you get things maybe settled, and even then you might have to stop, right? If they determine that the rule itself was fine, and the agency's method of interpreting the rule is good, and enforcing the rule is fine, then you might just have to go along with those things. So and that cease and desist order can certainly stay in place, where you just cannot go back to having those types of activities. Wells Fargo may have a cease and desist in terms of what they were doing, selling their accounts and whatnot. They may not. They may still be in the negotiating parts of that, but darn well there's regulators that are in there, and they're working those things out as we speak. So what if you don't follow the terms of the final order, like a cease and desist order? Ooh, they can haul you off like the creepy clown Ronald McDonald. So advising, right? So they advise make reports to the president or Congress about what's going on, good or bad or indifferent, what types of things. They accumulate facts, and some of them are, there's the Bureau of Economic Analysts or whatever, I think, BEA, and you and I wouldn't hardly care to read anything that they put out, although I do actually. I kind of enjoy it sometimes, but they report facts and ideas to the general public and to Congress, and the president about what's going on, and I don't know that the BEA has any real regulatory authority or anything, but we can get in and read a lot of the stats and whatnot that they have about the economy, and it's kind of cool. Okay, and publish advisory opinions then on different things, and any agency can do that, not just the BEA or agencies that have real enforcement authority and whatnot can still make reports to the president or Congress about things that are happening. Investigate, yeah, so they can have their own investigation team. They can get subpoenas. Okay. Reports, examine witnesses under oath, examining, so a lot of the due process stuff and discovery type process, right? And it is a crime to lie to an agency. And as we've talked about false statements before, since banks are regulated, if you lie to a bank, you're lying to an agency, technically. That's the way that works. But if you're a farmer and you're lying about the number of acres that you have or something like that, it can be a crime. Generally, the way they're organized is there's a chairperson, right, that presides at the meetings, appointed by the president and approved by the Senate, I believe. Secretary takes the minutes and legal custodian of the records. They generally have a general counsel, meaning it's also ratified by the Senate, meaning an attorney then that acts as like the attorney general, for that particular agency. He's the chief legal officer. And then they'll have an executive director, right, that's kind of the day-to-day person handling the ongoing affairs of that administrative agency. A director of operations, they have administrators. So these are just other additional staffing that you might have at an administrative agency. So public hearings, we talked about that. The public may present evidence supporting or opposing proposed agency, even if they don't have a local agency hearing, and often they won't. On some of these major ones, they won't. Okay, but that doesn't mean that you can't, make your opinion known, again, to the agency itself or oftentimes through members of Congress. So government control, and here's the main oversight, right? The president appoints chairs and generally may remove chairs, but Congress, they hold the purse strings, right? So they can abolish an agency if they don't think that it's doing its things properly. They can certainly alter the agency's budget or redefine their authority, if they disagree. And so that's kind of your checks and balance here, and the president certainly has some checks and balances in place in terms of appointing the chair and doing those types of things. The Federal Reserve is an agency that's deals with the banking system and interest rates and all those other things, and that's come up in discussions here in the presidential election as well about would Chairperson Yellen be reappointed by a Clinton or a Trump president? I don't know. Rulemaking, kind of talked about that. This is the Federal Register access URL if a person wanted to go and look at it. It's kind of interesting. You can click on it and look at it for just a couple minutes, and you might find some things that are of interest there. So who or is an agency's ruling absolutely final? Not necessarily, right? They're reviewable except when the statute precludes reviews. So there may be some cases where the agency and matters are just simply deemed to be settled by the agency and they can't go to court, right? Or the agency's action is committed to agency discretion by law, so similar again. Okay, but an aggrieved party, they have to be harmed by the agency action to have standing. So you have to be, personally, or the business has to be harmed, right, by the agency action. And the harm can be economic or non-economic. So it could be, physical harm, those types of things. So rules and regs have to be within the legislative grant of power. So who's gonna regulate that? What's the big merger that was just announced? Time Warner and AT&T. Well, who regulates that then? Okay, is that the Commerce Department? Well, maybe. Is it the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC? Well, yeah, but the FCC might be involved in that as well because that's Federal Communications and it deals with that. And so which one has the ultimate authority, or is it shared? Yeah, and in that case, it may be shared, but it kind of speaks to, in some cases, we might step over the line, or an agency might step over the line and try to regulate something over which they shouldn't have control. You've got, for example, on the ranch side, you've got USDA, United States Department of Agriculture, and you've also got the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. So who's responsible then for checking livestock, and who's responsible for making sure that the food supply is good, and regulating those types of things, and ensuring that it's cleanly and safe and all those other things. Well, again, they might step over their boundaries occasionally, and so a judge could make rulings on that. Was the delegation valid? The delegation by Congress to the agency, was it valid? Was it definite? And definite, and yet we always say that we always say that the powers given to agencies are usually very broad, okay? Usually very broad, okay? But then we also say that is it definite? So even though they're broad, an agency can get outside of their granted authority, and the courts would make rulings on that. Because agencies' powers are, here's the broad language, agency's power are limited to certain areas, so right? The language is broad, and could they have exceeded the authority that they had? Maybe, in which case the court may step in. Courts step in seldom, right? And that's where we get this. Judicial review is limited, right? Agency authority limited because it's delegated from the legislature, kind of the same things we just talked about. The courts lack authority to substitute for the agency, so the courts can't impose their own expertise, right? They can't, there's climate change things that have gone on, and agencies are expected to have the expertise in dealing with that. So a court can't just say, well, hell, I disagree with climate change, so we're just going to throw all that stuff out. I mean, they can say that, but then they'll probably be overturned at the next level, right? And so they have to rely on the scientific evidence and those types of things that the agencies are experts at, okay? But they rule on things of law, right? Due process, et cetera, et cetera. Some doctrines are this. There's one doctrine is an exhaustion of remedies. That means that if you're a bank and you're being audited by the Federal Reserve, say, and you have an argument with them, before you go to court, you have to make sure that you've exhausted all the remedies that you have with that particular agency. In that case, it would be the Federal Reserve. I see this, for example, I see this often in discrimination cases, where an individual may take a discrimination case, and be it federal or state, there's two levels, I guess, that you could go to depending on what your job is. But they call it a right to sue letter. So you've pursued it, you've gone to the EEOC, let's say it's a federal case, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and you're trying to work with the employer, the EEOC is working with them, you're trying to get these things resolved. But if they can't get it resolved, the EEOC will send you, the plaintiff, a letter that we used to call it a right to sue letter. Doesn't mean an obligation to sue, but it says, hey, you've exhausted all your remedies here with the EEOC, and so you have a right to sue. You can take it to court. And we've actually, in terms of discrimination, we're actually seeing quite a bit more of that. Okay, but primary jurisdiction is, they have to figure out which agency does, especially when there's overlap. There has to be maybe a primary jurisdiction, right? Equal Access to Justice Act, which we'll talk about here. I'm going to talk about it in a little bit, I guess. So the court, again, talked about that. They presume the findings of fact are correct. They do analyze the agency's proceedings. So again, they're looking for due process. Did the agency do things correctly in the right order? Did they notify the business, the people, the individual, whatever the case may be, properly? Did they procedurally do things correct? The court doesn't reweigh evidence. Don't make that independent determination, and don't substitute its view for the agency. Here's the equal access, right? So if you're successful, God, what happens if you're successful? But I mean, you could spend tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars fighting decisions, right? You can collect attorney's fees, but that's limited. Okay, so if you're an individual and you have a net worth of less than $2 million, you might be able to collect your attorney's fees, get those back. if you're a business with a net worth of less than 7 million. So all your big businesses and those types, I mean, they live with these regulators, and that's just a cost of doing business. You know, smaller businesses might be able to, if they're successful, they might be able to get their money back. But another clause here: government does not pay if actions were substantially justified. So, you know, might be difficult. So, criticisms of regulation, right? Cost regulation is a form of taxation, absolutely. Regulation forces bureaucracy in businesses. Again, absolutely. Imagine, and we're seeing this more and more. I mean, it's become far more onerous and far more difficult to start businesses, especially in certain industries, because the regulations are just so difficult to comply with. And so established businesses have an easier time. They're in place. They have money. They have policy, procedures, and those types of things already in place. Even if a new regulation comes along, they're a little more able to deal with that. And if you're just starting up, it's far more difficult, especially if you don't have a lot of backing, right? And that gets into this. Regulation can stifle the competition and innovation, and absolutely. We're seeing that in some statistics now. I know I've talked about how, for the last really couple of decades, we've been pushing a lot of new regulations and whatnot, supposedly for safety and all those other reasons, but we're also seeing definitely a slowdown in entrepreneurship here in the United States. Okay, and the mandated paperwork just creates an enormous cost and a burden. I talk to my old buddies that are in banking, and I've had a lot of them express that they wish they'd have banked, back in the days when I did. And of course, I wish I'd have banked back, 20 years before that, because the rules and regulations were way less onerous. Banks are actually shrinking. The number of banks are actually shrinking pretty dramatically, but I cannot even imagine the process it would take to start a new bank today, and the amount of money that you'd have to go through all the regulatory approvals and whatnot. It would be just unbelievable. So is there too much or too little regulation? Has government become too big? And maybe I'll give you my opinion, but if the car industry was deregulated, would you trust car makers to build safe and efficient cars? Libertarians would tell you that, as long as we have a rule of law and the ability to sue them, if their cars are not safe and efficient, it would maybe work itself out. Right? If the drug industry was deregulated, would you trust drug companies to provide safe medicines? Kind of the same thing. I'd hate to be the person that takes the untested one and dies. And so it's I guess in some cases, I suppose in my opinion, I would tell you that there's probably some areas where a little more regulation might be justified. And in a lot of areas, I would tell you that a lot less regulation would be justified. Let you guys come up with your own ideas on that. Great for discussion items, though. So it's my kind of guy. Drinking a beer, smoking a cigarette, and out shooting. Shooting what? I don't know. Maybe he's hunting. There you have it. That was a lot of stuff, and I got through it in relatively good order. It didn't take me a full hour, so chapter 15.